So, with the concept of core-dependent homonymy under our belts, let's look at some focally related examples of teleology. And I'll start with classic Aristotelian technology, which Aristotle discusses in Book 2, Chapter 3 of the Physics, and then again in Book 1, Chapter 3 of the Metaphysics. And the word that Aristotle uses for cause, when he speaks about the four causes, is aitia. It means reason, cause, responsibility, and legally it means blame. And so when Aristotle says, let's talk about what something is, he's going to say, let's sort out the four causes related to how that thing is the way it is. So we might even say that when Aristotle talks about the four causes, he's interested in four B-causes. So around here at Russell Gulch, we used to have, 100 years ago, hundreds of miners working in the mines. And on one of my walks around the property, I found this. It's an old whiskey bottle. And I don't know if you can see it that well, but there's, where is it now? Right here, there's an actual divot so that you can grab it with your hand and drink more effectively. It's also shaped so it fits very nicely in the breast pocket. So, well, what can we say? We can say the old miners were really serious about drinking on the job and they wanted to do it properly. But let's analyze the bottle, and we'll say, first of all, what's its material cause? Glass, right? What's its efficient cause? Okay, so in other words, why is it here? How did it get here? Well, it was cast away by some old miner, but before that, it was made in a factory or by a glass blower. So that's the efficient cause. How did it get to be here? How did it get to be the way it is? The formal cause, what's its structure? And I'm sure there are many other bottles like this. You find them in Nevada and Colorado. And they must have had a mold that they pressed them in, okay, to give them the proper shape. And so that's the formal cause. What's its pattern or shape? And then the final cause, right? And the final cause is that it's to hold your whiskey while you're breaking your back in the mine. And you'll notice that the purpose, holding your whiskey while you're breaking your back in the mine, that purpose or that final cause will determine what material it's made out of. So it's made out of glass, it's not made out of Kleenex, and it'll determine its structure. It's an enclosed figure. It's not flat. So that's the four-cause analysis. And you'll notice that Aristotle initially describes the four causes in terms of artifact teleology. And by that I mean a purpose that's imposed on an item from the outside. But that's not the only kind of teleology we encounter. We also encounter something that in the business we call natural teleology. And that's the function that emerges from what it is to be a particular thing. And so electromagnetism emerges from copper wire coiled around an iron nail and hooked to a battery. Or think of an acorn turning into an oak tree when it's given suitable growing conditions. And so that's a telos or a purpose that manifests from within the thing rather than imposed from the outside. So there we have classical Aristotelian teleology. Now let's move on to the discussion of law, which is a very good example of artifact teleology. And it's something that some legal philosophers would disagree with. There was a view, and there are some who still hold it, called legal positivism. It's associated with the names of figures like H.L.A. Hart, and Franz Kelsen. And legal positivism is a purely declaratory theory of law, Namely, what they'll say is that a rule is explicated simply by pointing to the last word of some final arbiter. So in the United Kingdom, that would be the Parliament. In the United States, it would be the Supreme Court of the United States. And so a good old-fashioned, dyed-in-the-wool legal positivist slogan would be, the law is the law. Okay? The law is simply what the lawmaking body declares it to be. Now, one objector to this position was a law professor from Harvard University. He was actually instrumental in creating the Universal Code of Contract Law, named Lon Fuller. And Lon Fuller said, well, wait a second. Just like we can fail to have a good contract because we don't draft it well, it's also possible to fail to make law. For example, the legislator can fail in his or her purpose, either through ambiguity. For example, let's say I made a law that said, oh, whenever there's any trouble anywhere, look for a bishop. Yeah, that's not observable because we don't really know what that means. Or it might not be practically observable. We might say parking tickets must be paid within 2 seconds of their issuance. Okay, not practically observable, a failure to make law. And also, a law can be logically or scientifically impossible. So, for example, one might tilt at windmills and decide to outlaw gravity, right? Or something that actually happened, the Indiana state legislature at the end of the 19th century passed, at least in the lower house of the Indiana legislature, they passed a law declaring that the value of pi was 3. Okay, it failed in the Indiana Senate narrowly. But we do have the famous Indiana Pi Bill, which would have been, if it became law, at least in Lon Fuller's view, a failure to make law because it failed in its purpose. Okay, so law has an artifact teleology about it, arguably. Now, sometimes we find people confusing artifact teleology with natural teleology. For example, there was a 17th century theologian named Abra de Racconi, who said that the sea was salty for 2 main reasons. First of all, so that codfish and tuna fish would have a suitable place to live. And secondly, so that ships would be more buoyant, and therefore the galleons could haul more gold back to Spain. But as Aristotle remarked in the Physics 198b18, Zeus's rain does not fall in order to make the grass grow, but in conformity with the laws of nature. And so I think we can reasonably set aside anthropocentric explanations, theological reasoning, and wishful thinking in general when we're thinking about natural teleology. Fourth, there appears to be a role for natural teleology when we think about environmental biology. So about 30 years ago, a philosopher at Colorado State University, his name was Holmes Rolston, got to thinking about how different government agencies were managing an outbreak of pink eye among Colorado's population of bighorn sheep. Now, the Colorado Division of Wildlife trapped the sheep and medicated them. And the idea behind that was that the Division of Wildlife's job was to look after state property so that hunters would have something to shoot and tourists would have something to gawk at. The National Park Service at Rocky Mountain National Park took a different approach. They decided to let the disease run its course in the herds in Rocky Mountain National Park. And here the idea was that sheep were members of a species dynamically interacting with an ecosystem. The end in view was not human use. Okay, so we weren't imposing a use from the outside, but instead herd immunity and potential genetic and epigenetic adaptation. The idea was that in Rocky Mountain National Park, the mechanisms of natural selection and the mechanisms of mutation would be allowed to continue operating. So the National Park Service had a deeper ecological approach based on natural teleology, while the Colorado Division of Wildlife had a shallower ecology akin to livestock managing. And Rolston's controversial claim, or at least controversial at the time, was that the national park's biologists regarded DNA as, Rolston's phrase, a teleological molecule. Now, this is a claim that Thomas Nagel would be sympathetic toward, right? Because in Nagel, the idea is that if we're really going to explain how nature works, we need to think about nature in terms of natural teleology.